Today on Family Talk.
Well, it's time for another edition of Family Talk, which, as I hope you know, is a division of James Dobson Family Institute. My name is James Dobson, and I'm your host for this program today. And we're going to be talking about a topic that is very dear to my heart, the homeschooling movement, or what some people call parent-based education. I believe in it, and we want to talk today about why. You may have heard my story before, but allow me to repeat it for those who have, because I think it's important to understand how in the world I got interested in this subject and why it's so important to me now. When I was a graduate student at the University of Southern California, getting a PhD in child development, it was the belief at the time that early childhood education was essential to proper brain development. It was the universal passion among child development experts at the time. And if you didn't believe in it, there was something wrong with you. Everybody thought that you had to get your kids into not only early education, but early formal education. Hopefully in kindergarten or better in the preschool years. And if you didn't do that, they would never catch up. That's what was believed. And we just now know that that is not so. Well, I heard about another doctoral student at the time I was at USC. He was about 3 years ahead of me, and he graduated and went on to challenge conventional wisdom on this matter. His name was Ray Moore, and he became Dr. Ray Moore, and he was doing research indicating that early childhood education, especially formal education, outside the home was not only not necessary to brain development, but was potentially detrimental. Dr. Ray Moore, one of his early books, by the name of Better Late Than Early, was just packed with research showing that children in the early years needed to be protected from their peers. They're very vulnerable to peer pressure. They need to be around their parents more, and they need all that parents can give when they devote themselves largely to their children. I promptly contacted Dr. Moore, and I asked if he would like to come and be a guest on my program, Focus on the Family Radio, which was only about 3 years old at the time. And he said he knew of me and was glad to come, and we became great friends. To make a long story short, he began talking about better late than early, how you could take kids and teach them at home. Dr. Moore not only used that occasion to talk about better late than early, but he talked with great intensity about parent education and talked about how that had been the history of education, not only in this country, but in Britain and around the world. Because you're trying to teach the totality of the Christian message within an educational setting, it's something that if I had it to do over again, I would do that way. Now, especially because my wife Shirley was a teacher, and so was I. I taught 6th grade, 7th, 8th grade, science and math, so we had some background. But even if we didn't, I would want to educate my kids myself because it was just too important. Well, we aired those first programs with Dr. Moore, and I really didn't know how many people were out there because it was 3 years into my own second career, if you will. But when we aired those programs, we were inundated. I'm not kidding. We had tens of thousands of letters and phone calls, and nearly all of them said one thing: tell me more. They wanted to know. And that was the beginning of the modern homeschool program. Well, that was 38 years ago, and the homeschool movement is well established now in countries around the world. And today we want to give you an update on what's going on that front. And I have two knowledgeable guest today whom I respect highly. First, I want you to meet, if you don't know him already, Michael Donnelly is the senior attorney and the director of global outreach for Homeschool Legal Defense Association. He's also an adjunct professor of government and constitutional law at Patrick Henry College. It's a great school. I've been there on campus many times. It's small, but I tell you, it's a wonderful college. Mike is also an internationally published writer, a frequent speaker on parental rights and human rights globally, and I've said he's a licensed attorney. Also with me is Jenna Ellis, a director of public policy for the Dobson Family Institute. She's been on this program a few times in the past, but also you have probably seen her on television lately because she's a frequent guest on Fox News, CNN, and other media outlets. She's all over the place, in fact. Jenna is also a constitutional attorney and received her JD from the University of Richmond School of Law. She's a very busy lady these days. How do you account for what's happening to you? Because you're like a rocket that's gone up, and nearly every weekend we can see you on television, and you're out there making the case for the things that we believe. I appreciate you doing that. You were homeschooled yourself.
Yes, I was homeschooled from kindergarten all the way through high school and graduated as a homeschool student, and then, of course, went on to college and law school. And my parents homeschooled here in Colorado, and they decided to homeschool really for the purpose of my mom wanting to spend more time with us. She was a stay-at-home mom.
That's a pretty good reason.
It is. And she had, they, of course, were Christians and wanted to give my older brother and I, and now my little brother who's being homeschooled, a faith-based education. They really had no idea what they were getting into and found a lot of support through HSLDA and other places, and it was the most wonderful experience that
How do you feel about it? I mean, tell us what that experience was like for you.
It was so much fun because I really think that my older brother and I have a much better relationship than I would have had otherwise because we got to spend so much time together as a family. And what it did for me personally with my relationship with God and my calling in the law was to be able to have time to really consider where my calling was, my passions were, and my skill set. So I actually knew I wanted to go to law school when I was 14. And the reason
you really?
I did, I participated in a homeschool civics program that taught law and government, and I came home from that camp and told my parents, I want to go to law school. God wants me to be a lawyer. And they said, well, great, we'll support you in that. And homeschooling is really the reason that I had those opportunities to figure out what I liked and also where God was gifting me.
Was there ever a time when you resented being there when your friends on the block and in church were in public schools and there was a football team and all the things that go along with public schools? Did you ever want or long for that?
Not at all. I mean, I think they were actually jealous of me because I got to go and do a lot of other things. Like at 15 years old, I was down at the Colorado State Capitol as the youngest intern for the lieutenant governor. I was networking with people. I was figuring out what I was going to do for God in my life. And they were dealing with the peer pressure, with going out for cheerleading and all of these other things that ultimately didn't matter as much and had a lot more difficult time with it than I did.
Well, I want to come back to that. Mike, let me ask about how you got into homeschooling and what was your introduction to it?
So my path to homeschooling was very interesting. I wasn't a Christian, came to know the Lord when I was in law school. Then my wife and I started to have children.
Who introduced you to Christ?
Do you ever hear of a guy named Tom Hopkins? The great salesman, Tom Hopkins, friend of Zig Ziglar?
Yes.
Yeah, Tom Hopkins was the guy who led me to Christ.
Really?
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story, law school, salesman, being led to the Lord. But on the day I was saved, 70 people got saved that day.
Is that right?
It was pretty amazing. Anyway, God was working on me and my wife, too, at the time. She was pregnant. And so we were confronted with this miracle that was growing inside her and trying to make sense of it without God. And we were confronted with that, and the Lord was just working on us, and He led me through that process. But once we had our children, we had several children in about two.
You got 7 now.
Well, we have 7. That's right. Now we have 7 children from 21 to 7. And but in the year 2000, I'd been practicing law for a few years, and I had a running partner. And we were running one day, and he asked me, so what are you going to do with your kids for school? My oldest was 3 or 4 at the time, and I hadn't really thought about it. And I said, well, I'm not really sure, but I certainly am not going to send them to the public school system. I want my children to go to a place where they can be affirmed in their faith, and that's not possible in the public schools, as you alluded to. God is not welcome in the public school system in America. And so he said, well, have you ever heard of homeschooling? And he had a couple of children that he was homeschooling. And I said, homeschooling, what is that? I'd never heard of it, even though you talked about it 20 years earlier.
Yeah, 20 years earlier, I didn't know what it was either.
When he said the words homeschooling, it was like a light bulb went off for me. And I went back and I was very enthusiastic about the idea. And my wife had been an elementary school teacher for a few years, and I figured this is great. She'd always told me her 2 dreams in life were to be a mom and a teacher. And I said, this is great. We can put them together. And and she was a little bit less enthusiastic. She'd not heard the idea herself before. She said, what are you talking about, homeschooling? What's that? And so we talked about it, we prayed about it, and we decided to give it a shot. This was in Massachusetts, and we went to a homeschool convention in Massachusetts and saw the curriculum that was available and all the cool stuff, and met with all the families and found out, wow, this is actually pretty big deal. There's lots of people doing this. This isn't so crazy. And so we decided to start doing it, and we did it, and we've homeschooling all of our children for about 20 years or so.
Were your other family members and neighbors and others critical of you for doing this?
My wife's parents were pretty skeptical, but we were committed to it. We believed that this was the right thing to do. We felt we were called to do it. And over the years, they have seen the fruit of homeschooling. And when you look at the homeschooling movement and the children in the homeschooling movement and the research that has been done, and you see what they're doing, you can see how homeschooling really works.
How about the concept of better late than early?
I love that idea. I wasn't confronted. I'd never heard of that idea until I got involved in the homeschool movement professionally either, and learned about Ray Moore. But it makes a lot of sense. At HSLDA, we are a watchdog organization. We look at legislation. We watch legislation and make sure that the legislatures do not intrude on family freedom. And early childhood education, we believe, is one of those areas that actually erodes parental rights and family freedoms, because it's requiring children to go into the institutional environment of school earlier and earlier. The NEA is one of the organizations that has opposed the development and growth of homeschooling for many, many years. And they have, as part of their platform, that children should be in a professional education environment taught by certified teachers from age 3 to 21.
See, that's what I was taught. Everybody in public education or in that arena was talking that way, and they talked like they knew what they were talking about. There was a lot of big-time child development experts who were saying that. And it was not only that this is an option, it was that you're damaging your kids if you don't do it.
Well, we're seeing that that's not true, as you alluded to earlier. And so we oppose that kind of legislation because we believe that parents are the ones who should be deciding when their children are ready. And as Ray Moore said, it's often better, especially for boys, for them to wait a little bit longer because they're not quite mature enough to sit in that institutional environment. I had 4 boys. My wife, we started with 4 boys and 2 girls and a boy. And, my second son especially, Matthew, who goes to Patrick Henry College, he was a rambunctious young man. And my wife had a tough time teaching him. I had to take over teaching him reading sometimes because he just wouldn't sit still. I can't imagine him sitting still in a classroom for hours and hours. He would have been in the principal's office every day.
We put boys especially, who tend to be at least 6 months behind girls at every stage in their early childhood era. They just are not as mature as girls are, but schools are designed for girls, not little boys, especially those that are driven from within like that.
Well, whether they're ADD or just boys, and you wrote a book, Bringing Up Boys, which I've read and was very helpful for me as a young father, understanding that. And I was like, oh, that was me. I was like that. That's why I was getting detention or having trouble with the kindergarten teacher. I was just being a boy. When you look around the world at this, you also see that there are problems. You can see, for example, Sweden. The suicide rate for children is very high in Sweden. And one of the reasons I think that might be the case is because they put children in daycare as early as 18 months. In fact, they actually want, there's a lot of pressure for parents to put their children in daycare as young as 12 months, 18 months, because they want the women to go out and work. And you know as well as I do that, babies need that maternal relationship. It's very important to children bonding with their parents, bonding with their mother, and they need that so that they can become self-assured.
That's
right?
all. That's cruel. I think it cruel. To take it. Not that every woman has to stay at home full time.
That's right.
But young children, particularly toddlers, they really need the stability that comes from knowing your caregiver, putting them in some kind of institution where those leaders, child development people, teachers, and so on, change from time to time and maybe day by day. That is very harmful to children, in my view.
Well, we would agree with that, and that's one of the reasons we oppose those kinds of efforts to increase mandatory kindergarten laws and those sorts of things. Because
is that still going out there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Every year there are states all over the country that want to introduce mandatory kindergarten, full-day kindergarten. They're introducing preschool at earlier and earlier ages as either mandatory or fully funded. And people just do it.
What about the parents who don't want to do that? Are they being pressured legally to put their kids in some kind of formalized setting?
Now, there isn't so much legal pressure, although when they reduce the compulsory attendance age down to age 5, which there are a number of states that have that, that's legal pressure. But for 4 and 3, it's more societal pressure, or they want to go out and back to work.
Even at 5, I don't think kids are ready for that.
Most states' compulsory attendance ages are 5 and 6. There are only a few states where there are 7 or 8. Very, very few. And that has been the trend in the last 15 years, is to reduce the age to earlier and earlier compulsory attendance in school.
Well, as I indicated, Dr. Raymore found in his research that children can catch up if placed into even formal educational situations, maybe at 4th grade or 5th grade or 6th grade, and they go zipping to the top. It doesn't always happen, but nothing always happens. But that's a typical situation, and that's what the research found. Well, and you're trying to support that in the public arena as well.
We are advocates for home education, so we stand for defending the rights of parents to choose, home education. Of course, at the end of the day, we also believe that parents are the ones who are empowered by God, we would say, to make those decisions. And they're really the best ones to make those decisions about how a child is educated, whether it's homeschooling, public schooling, private schooling. At the end of the day, God is going to look at us as parents and say, hey, these children were a blessing to you. How did you steward them? How can you answer for them? Did you guide them into a relationship with me? Did you point them to me? And these are things for Christian parents that are very important, should be important.
Well, in the states that are more liberal, and the educational system is therefore far more liberal, such as California, Massachusetts, and elsewhere, but especially California. I just had a mother come up to me 3 or 4 weeks ago to tell me that in her area, the kindergartners are being taught gender concepts that I consider to be very, very radical to 5-year-olds who don't even know what sexuality is all about and shouldn't. It's not time for that. They don't need that information developmentally. And yet that is about to be the law of the state in California.
I would agree with you. And at the end of the day, it's parents who should be the ones making that decision as to when and how their children are introduced to concepts of sexuality. And, you'd want parents to be affirmed and supported in making those decisions. But what we hear at HSLDA is that there are a lot of parents who are homeschooling their children because of that. They don't want their children to be forced into those kinds of situations. And so they decide to homeschool them. And in California, actually, homeschooling is not very difficult to do. There's not a lot of governmental regulation, although we had to fight the California legislature pretty hard this last year because they wanted to impose a lot of regulation on homeschooling.
Like what?
Well, they wanted to require home visits. They wanted to have oversight over curriculum, the kinds of things that you would expect to have in California, which you don't. We were successful by God's grace. But there are attempts around the country to rein in and impose more regulation on homeschooling. And you see that in other countries around the world as well, because there are movements that see education as a way to indoctrinate children, and they use the public education system to do that if they can get away with it. And they're getting away with it in some cases. Did
parents come to your aid in fighting the legislature on those issues?
It was amazing. There were thousands and thousands of parents who turned out, all kinds of parents, not just homeschooling, but there were other people who were involved in supporting us and winning that fight, and it was a great day in California when we won that fight.
Here's another old story, but I love telling it. I know I will tell it as long as I'm on the air. But there was a congressman from California who came to the Congress, and he was determined to require parents who are teaching at home to be licensed in each field that they were going to teach, so that a homeschool mother would have to go back to school to learn all these different courses that she was going to take. And that would really have shut down home education in the state of California. And I heard about it. In fact, Michael Ferris called me, and I said, we got to do something about this. And we went on the air and told everybody about that. And there was such an outcry that it literally melted the switchboard of the Congress, the House of Representatives. And everybody ran for the tall grass because all of a sudden they were supporting something that was going to lose them votes, and you can count on it, it would have. And the legislation that was expected to pass got one vote, and that was that dude from California that introduced it.
Well, you're talking about H.R. 6, and that is a fabled battle of lore in the homeschool movement, and a time when the political powers that be reckoned with the homeschool movement, and they wrangled and they lost. And that has been repeated many times over the years as we as a movement have fought for freedom, to advance freedom, to protect our freedom. And what I've seen doing this for 12 years now is when you get homeschool parents out to the Capitol with their children, they win. And because it's about freedom. And, you know, our country is based on this idea of freedom and respecting parents and respecting people making decisions for their families, even though we're fighting for that today, and you're fighting for that with the Dobson Family Institute, and thank God you are. It's a battle that we're fighting today, but I've seen victories in the homeschool movement, and I'm very, very confident that we're going to be able to protect that. But freedom is something that has to be constantly watched over. And that's what HSLDA is about. That's what we stand for.
Well, let me say to the parents who are listening to us today, if you still have children, or even if you don't, parents are much less willing to let their voices be heard than they were then. We saw then what can happen if the constituency out there speaks with one voice. And if you make one call and it's multiplied by millions, you can change this country. We kind of feel like it's out of our hands. The Congress is not responsive, and they do what they want to do, and everybody forgets by election time. I'm telling you, you must stay involved. And that was a beautiful example of it. We cheered when we heard that news, and I'll bet you did too.
Well, I didn't know about it at the time. I was in the Army in 1993 when this was going on, or 94, and so I'd never heard of homeschooling at that time. But I'm glad you won that battle because it made it more possible for the rest of us.
Well, this is Roger Marsh, and unfortunately, we've run out of time for today's broadcast of Family Talk. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for the conclusion of Dr. James Dobson's conversation with Mike Donnelly and Jenna Ellis. They'll discuss homeschooling on a global scale and how parents are preparing their kids socially for the real world. So we hope you'll join us then. As we wrap up this program, I want to thank you for your generosity in supporting our ministry. Your donations fuel us in our mission to uphold marriages and families around the world. Learn how you can partner with us by visiting drjamesdobson.org or by calling 877-732-6825. Thanks for your contributions and for tuning in today. I'm Roger Marsh, reminding you to join us again tomorrow for more of Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk.
This has been a presentation of the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute.
Hi everyone, this is Roger Marsh. Here at Family Talk, we strongly believe in our rights as Americans to make our voices heard at the polls. This is why we are urging you to get out and vote in the 2018 midterm elections. Are you unfamiliar with the key races around the country? Well, visit drjamesdobson.org to download our informative voter guide and revisit our site on Election Day to click the I Voted button that we'll have there. The future of America depends on our involvement in this crucial election. So pray, be engaged, and cast your vote this November 6th.